All right, golfers, I want to film a quick video here for everybody regarding flipping, and we're going to focus on what happens through impact specifically. Now, essentially, flipping, just to kind of clarify this a little bit further, is the rotation of the forearms and the wrists through the golf ball. So you think of like where the palm of my hand is facing here. If my palm is facing to the sky and it never turns over at all, there is no forearm rotation, no flipping involved, right? The club face stays very passive, arguably too much in this scenario. Or you'll see the opposite extreme, which is where the palm now goes from the sky to the ground way too fast for some golfers. Usually that's associated more to the better players. And you'll see if I have the club in my hands here as I do this, and I'll keep the palm facing up just to show you. If I twist this thing down to the ground, the toe turns over too fast. And obviously, that can create a lot of overdraws for players if they struggle with that. It's very timing based. So really there's two extremes in the golf swing. Now, depending on your pattern, you can either slow down the amount of forearm rotation you have or speed it up. And believe it or not everybody needs to slow it down. There's a bunch of drills on the internet, obviously on YouTube, of like, hey, let's stop flipping, let's stop flipping. But in reality, there are some golfers who need that much forearm rotation through the golf ball, or sometimes they actually need to increase it a little bit farther. So what would cause the two extremes? Well, really, it depends on how you're swinging into the golf ball that will dictate whether you can actually change how much your forearms are going to turn over at the bottom. So the two extremes would be the high handicap golfer, more commonly, who cuts across the ball too much. A lot of times what you'll see in that scenario is that the hands and club are going to work way too inward through the ball, meaning because this club is pitching likely out in front of the body and the golfer is cutting across it too much, in order to make contact with the ball when the club head is like way out there, the only way to do that is to jerk my hands really low and inside. That's how I can hit the actual ball and make sure that the ball actually gets airborne. And because I have an intended target in mind, a lot of times you'll see a certain level of forearm rotation take place. And in this scenario, it's too little. Now, why is it too little? Well, because if I'm swinging across the ball this much, right, now my club head is going towards the back left corner of my screen as a right-handed golfer here. That's clearly cutting across. My club path would be something like 10 degrees from outside in, maybe even more. Well, in that scenario, if I have forearm rotation, which we know turns the club face over, well, if I'm cutting across the ball and I'm going to turn the club face over, I'm going to hit this ball in a terrible position. I will never get anywhere near my target, right? So in order to give my ball a chance of actually curving back towards the target, given how much I'm cutting across it, what you'll see a lot of times in these scenarios is the golfer is going to have way too little amount of forearm rotation, meaning that palm that I showed you where it faces the sky, they're going to keep that palm facing the sky for as long as possible. Now, the reason they do this is because that's the only way I can take this extremely outside in path and actually get this ball a chance of hitting, again, my intended target, which is always going to be in this scenario, let's say the middle of the screen. Okay. So in order for that golfer to actually make sure they come into the golf ball a little more neutral, they actually need to increase their form rotation, or they really need to strengthen their club face to match the little amount of forearm turning over they have at the bottom. Okay, so for example, if I do that same situation where I'm cutting across it, but again, now let's say my club face is closed. Well, if I have very little forearm rotation, but my club face is really closed, let's say maybe because of a super strong grip, again, my ball's just going to take off super low and left in this situation. It's never going to come back. It doesn't work. And you'll actually see the inverse be created in the sense of the club face is actually too open in this situation, and the golfer is going to cut across the ball to actually try to give themselves a chance of starting the ball to the left. It's almost the situation of like the chicken or the egg. Sometimes the club face causes the golfer to cut across it too much. Sometimes the golfer's already cutting across it too much and they start to really slow down the forearms to give them a chance of curving the ball towards the target. The only thing that's important in this situation is knowing what the actual pattern and matchup is. It's not necessarily important to know, did the club face create the club path? Did the club path create the club face? Doesn't matter. That's what that player is dealing with at that moment. Now, the opposite extreme you'll see is the golfer who's stuck way too much under the plane, meaning they're actually coming into the golf ball way too much from the inside, way too shallow. Well, if I have very little forearm rotation in this situation, right, and this club head is coming from behind me, even if my club face is closed, well, what's going to happen, right? And now I'm going to take a square club face here just to give everybody the visual. I'm going to put my palm facing sideways. Now I'm going to bring this club head to the inside, right? Because this golfer in this scenario is stuck way too shallow. Well, if my forearms never turn over through the golf ball, what's going to happen? That ball is going to hit directly to the right side of the screen. So what starts to happen instinctively over time for these better players is a lot of them don't work on squaring this up by rotating better, which is my preference, because rotating better would take this club head that's way too shallow. And the more I turn my body, the more I bring this club on a better plane in front of me, the more I can come into the ball more square. And I'll actually square my club face doing that as well. Now, golfers, because they have an intended target in mind, and a lot of these better players are athletes, what happens is they won't do that, right? Because that's not really instinctual for them to want to do that. What takes place oftentimes instead is, well, if I don't rotate my forearms, that ball's going to hit the right side of the screen. So how do I get this ball to come back to the target? I have an excessive amount of forearm rotation because I'm basically taking a ball that's going to go way out there, and the only way for me to start it back to my target, I got to turn these arms over aggressively. So the two extremes really that you'll deal with a lot is you're going to have the golfer who's too shallow, who's got way too much forearm rotation, or the golfer who's cutting way across the golf ball, and in order for them to hit their target, they have way too little amount of forearm turn. So again, you can consider this flipping if you want. I like to look specifically at the forearms and the wrists. And so in both of these extreme cases, the only reason that golfer developed those patterns, either too much or too little, is because they have that intended target in mind where they're trying to hit the middle of the screen. Okay. And so the best way to fix these golfers is, well, if you're going to take this golfer who's cutting way too much across the golf ball and you're going to try to get them to swing a little more shallow and from the inside, well, you need to then also change a little bit how their forearms are releasing through the golf ball because they naturally now have a pattern that's been ingrained of not turning their forearms over. So if they're going to cut across their golf ball with way too little forearm rotation, and you're going to try to get them more shallow, but their forearms haven't adapted to that, that ball's going 150 yards right in my scenario here, right? It's never going to work. And so what happens is that golfer, while they're working on getting shallow, they either need to really strengthen this club face somehow, or they need to make sure that they gradually start to add just a little bit more forearm rotation. Now, I'm not telling that golfer to do this, right? But some amount of forearm rotation is very important to help them square things up. So they need to train the forearms a little bit more through the golf ball. We're not getting them to flip at it. We're just getting them to add a little bit of forearm rotation so that it's not overly passive. In the opposite scenario, right, you have the golfer who's got way too much of it, meaning they're way too shallow, body's not turning, they're swinging too far from the inside, and their forearms are way too excessive. In that situation, then you need to get the body moving better so that they don't need to flip the forearms over. Because the body moving better takes this club, like I said, and it brings it on a better plane, right? If I'm under rotated, I'm coming in this way. I need to flip the forearms to square it up. But if I'm, instead of being here at this point, I am more rotated. Well, now my club is not only coming on a better plane, but now I've given my hand space to work inside an appropriate amount, not an excessive amount, an appropriate amount. And what that does is, the more my body rotates through the ball, the more the arms work inside. The more the arms work inside, the less my forearms are going to turn over. So the best way to stop that golfer from flipping, if you're somebody who's too shallow and too stuck, you got to get them rotating, and they won't flip those forearms over nearly as much. That's why I'm always skeptical when you see people trying to work on slowing down the forearms through the ball, or slowing down what you would call flipping, by taking an alignment stick, putting it between their lead hand and the grip. Now, everybody, I'm sure, has seen this video on the internet, right? If I rotate my forearms over, or if I release my wrist too much, I'm going to whack myself into the side. Well, the problem is I can manufacture this all I want while the stick is here, right? But if my body is never going to actually rotate much better through the ball, the second that stick is gone, guess what I'm going to do the minute this club gets right back into this overly shallow position? I'm going to go right back to this because I have an intended target in mind. And if I don't flip and I'm too shallow, that ball is going way out there. It just doesn't work. So keep in mind, everything that you do in your golf swing is meant to either help you or hurt you. Just because you have too much forearm rotation through the golf ball doesn't mean you can immediately just get rid of it. You have to see what is causing you to have to do that at the bottom. Sometimes that forearm rotation is necessary to give you a chance of hitting your target, even though aesthetically it's not the best looking move through the golf ball, right? So depending on where your pattern is, just understand that you can't always just get rid of things just because they look bad. You really need to understand the root cause of why you're doing things, and then you can work to start changing those tendencies. So just a little bit of a brief explanation on forearm rotation through the golf ball, how to look at it depending on which side of the extreme you're at. Then you'll know if you can start to change it or not.